Will there be marriage in heaven and polygamy for eternity? We'll talk about that next on Polygamy, What Love Is This? As our viewers know, we take Mormonism's claims and compare them with what the Bible teaches so that we can discern truth from error, because that's what God expects us to do. Recently, someone quoted something that author Aldous Huxley said, and we thought we would share.
The deepest sin against the human mind is to believe things without evidence. Without evidence.
Without evidence.
That really blew me away.
I thought it was appropriate for this topic that we're going to be talking about. And we do like to point out that although the Bible has thousands of manuscripts as evidence of its historical and linguistic and archaeological and other proofs of its authenticity and reliability, the Mormonism rejects the evidence, but at the same time accepts the Book of Mormon that has no evidence at all, none. And they embrace it as the cornerstone of their faith. So they reject the evidence and accept the non-evidence. And not only does no evidence exist for the Book of Mormon to support it, there's much evidence, both internal and external, that disproves its claims, including DNA and biological evidence. Now, Huxley said that it's a sin against the human mind to believe without evidence. And God said, test everything.
Right.
We quote from 1 Thessalonians 5:21.
But test everything, hold fast to what is good.
Okay, test everything. God told us to. And so we're disobeying God when we don't test what we believe. But Mormonism says don't question, accept without evidence, trust your leaders, and it'll strengthen your faith. Now, many people claim that there's no evidence for God. But God gives us evidence of His love, His beauty, and His existence every single day. In fact, the heavens declare the glory of God. We quote from the Bible book of Psalms.
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard.
God's creation is seen by everyone, all around the world, all the time, day after day, night after night. There is evidence for God, and that He loves us, the beauty of His creation, and so on. All of this is leading up to the question, why does Mormonism insist there is marriage after this life when Jesus said there wasn't? They're not testing the truth. Okay?
Right. They just believe because that's what they're told.
That's what they're told to believe. And not only marriage, but polygamy. And if Mormonism would accurately teach what Jesus said about the topic, it would save a lot of people from a lot of grief in this life. In November of 2016, we released a two-part series discussing a book entitled The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. You can go to our website and watch the episodes. They're number 9.44 and 9.45, and the link to that show is on the screen. We are going to revisit this topic because an article was recently posted online by the Religious News website, and the headline reads, Eternal Polygamy, ? How does LDS temple sealings and cancellations become a raw deal for women? Surprise! LDS church policies around temple sealings and cancellations used to be more equal for women than they are today. What happened? Now, this article was written May 17th of 2024, and the author was by Jana Reese. And the link is on the screen if you want to read the full article. It deals with the troublesome doctrine of polygamy for eternity and how heartbreaking it is for women of Mormonism. Now, if it's heartbreaking for the women in the LDS church who do not have to share their husbands in this life, knowing that they will share him in the next life, imagine how heartbreaking it is for the polygamous women who are coerced into sharing her husband in this life and the next. The article begins like this.
Many tears have been shed and much ink spilt about gender equality in Mormon temple
Inequality.
Gender inequality in Mormon temple sealing rituals. In our religion, a man and a woman can be sealed together in a Latter-day Saint temple for time and all eternity, meaning their marital bonds will remain in effect forever. The temple sealing allows them to live together after death in the celestial kingdom, along with their children, forever and ever, worlds without end. Amen.
Okay, now the author of this article says that eternal families is a beautiful belief, except what? Well, actually, eternal families is not even a biblical concept. There is a family of God, and that family of God consists of those who have been adopted by God in this life and who will be with God and with each other in eternity. But the most important thing is that we will be with Jesus eternally. Being with Him far outweighs any other eternal relationship. We want to quote what Jesus said and who He claimed were His family.
Matthew 12:46-50. While He was still speaking to the people, behold, His mother and His brothers stood outside, asking to speak to Him. But He replied to the man who told Him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out His hand toward His disciples, He said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whomever does the will of the Father in heaven is my brother and sisters and mother."
So Jesus is claiming that His family was not necessarily His mother and brothers, His blood family, but His family consists of His disciples and those who do God's will. It's pretty clear, and really should clear away many false beliefs about eternal families. Now, it's not God's will to live polygamy or to perform marriage ceremonies and rituals that promise an eternity that doesn't even exist. The author of this article explains why it is not necessarily a beautiful idea to seal Mormon couples for eternity in their temples. We quote,
"Complications arise when a couple gets divorced, which is far rarer among temple marriage Latter-day Saints than other couples, but still happens. Or one spouse dies and the other remarries. The tears and frustration have come because temple sealing after remarriage distinctly favors LDS men, not women."
Okay, now we're going to get into a convoluted kind of discussion here, and we hope our viewers can follow it. And if you're familiar with Mormon rituals and sealings and unsealings and all that, you'll probably be able to follow it okay. In Mormonism, men can be remarried in a Mormon temple ritual after a legal divorce. Now, all of this spills over into the polygamy groups, too, because they also have their special sealings and their special releases from their sealings and so on. So it all spills over into the polygamy group, too.
Yes.
So a man can be remarried in a Mormon temple ritual after a legal divorce, but the first marriage remains valid for eternity. So he will be a polygamist in Mormon heaven.
Right.
But women in Mormonism can be sealed in a second marriage only after the first presidency agrees to cancel their first sealing, something the man is not required to do. We quote further from the article.
"Living women can't be sealed to more than one man for eternity, but men can be sealed to more than one woman. This leads to what author Carol Lynn Pearson has called eternal polygamy. The policy feels like a holdover from the days of plural marriage, when LDS men were allowed, even commanded, to wed multiple women. Even though the practice of the plural marriage hasn't been sanctioned by the church in well over a century, its legacy has endured. Painful in our sealing policies."
Well, its legacy...
Painfully, sorry.
Its legacy is endured in more than just the sealing policies, its legacy of plural marriage. And just look at the pain of the polygamy groups that's going on today. The legacy is much more than that. But we know what we know what she's saying, because that's the topic of our discussion, the temple sealing ceremony. The author tells us that the strange Mormon temple sealing rules were more equitable for women in former times than they are today, that only in the 20th century have they become grossly unequal, which is kind of strange considering how women's, equality issues have been so prevalent more recently. Before we continue, we must point out that there are no biblical mandates for temple rituals of marriage or plural marriage in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. They're useless as far as the Bible teaching goes. They were invented by Joseph Smith to help support polygamy, and they have been changed from time to time since Smith introduced the original sealing ceremony. Now, this article discusses a history of this unique Mormon marriage ritual. She refers to an article by Nathan Oman, a legal scholar and professor at the William and Mary Law School in Virginia, that was published in the Journal of Mormon History in 2003. This article traces how temple sealing rules developed bit by bit. This is what she explained happened.
All right. In the 19th century LDS temple marriage, some men were sealed to multiple wives, and some women were sealed to multiple husbands. If those early bonds were dissolved through a divorce, the temple sealing remained intact for both men and women, even if they remarried other people. This resulted, Oman notes, in numerous living women being sealed to 2 or more men.
No, so it's getting a little complicated here. It's getting a little bit crowded in these women's bedrooms.
That happened so much in my group. Even they were still alive, and the woman would be sealed to another man.
Well, they were still living. Wow. Mm-hmm. Of course, that would be with the polygamy group. That would be more believable than with the Mormon Church. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, this practice is beyond any moral compass that you'll find in the Bible. Absolutely. Yeah. For viewers who are unaware of certain unique practices of Mormonism, sealing is a ritual they do which will connect, marry, and seal spouses together for eternity. The sealing cannot be broken except under certain circumstances. But like we said, there's no such teaching in the Bible, either in the Old Testament or the New, and the Old Testament temple was never used for marriages. But sealing multiple men to multiple women and vice versa completely destroys the one man, one woman marriage that God brought to humanity in the Garden of Eden. And all through the Bible, we are reminded a man is supposed to have only one wife at a time in this life. We are commanded to follow God's will, not follow the behavior of Abraham and Jacob and David or any other polygamist in the Bible. Yeah. Biblically, a remarriage was possible only if a spouse passes away. We quote from Romans
7:2 and 3. For a married woman is bound by the law of her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress.
Okay, so marriage is only for this life. And if there was an eternal marriage, surely it would have been addressed in a passage like this in the Bible. Yeah. But we know that God doesn't show favoritism, and we know that one spouse at a time is equally true for both the male and the female. If spouses could be sealed to more than one at a time, God would have said so in the Bible, but he didn't. And there's no eternal sealing. He would have said so in the Bible for marriage, but he didn't. And the article tells us that the Mormon Church began developing a belief that the sealing power behind the authority to cancel sealings, which the person who performed the marriage had that power. In other words, get a spiritual divorce. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, they would say they can bind in heaven and they can loose in heaven.
Right. They're taking a biblical passage and misapplying it to
totally
marriage.
Misapplying it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, in the rare cases, the president of the church or of the prophet of the polygamy group could cancel the temple sealings, usually because of abuse or apostasy. And as polygamy was phased out by the LDS Church, they formalized the cancellation of sealings and made new rules in the process, like God always changes his mind, right? We quote.
Under the new rules, men could be sealed to 2 or more women so long as they were only married in life to one woman at a time. In other words, if they weren't practicing this world polygamy, but a woman could only be sealed to one man, either in life or posthumously. Oman says this limitation for women entered Mormon life in the 1930s, but only appeared in the handbook for the first time in 1944.
Okay, several years later, it finally appeared in the handbook. Now, this caused requests for exceptions to the rule. In fact, the church was deluged with exception requests because in 1944, it appeared in the handbook because there were so many women who were widowed in World War II. And they were still young ladies, young women, and they wanted to remarry, and they wanted temple sealings if they were members of the church. So the LDS Church allowed the exceptions and permitted widows to remarry another man for eternity, without canceling their first temple sealing to the husband who died in the war. And this began to confuse unnecessary confusion with the people. Even after the Mormon handbook specified that living women could not be sealed to more than one man, they allowed case-by-case exceptions. But another upheaval was coming. We quote,
"In the mid to late 20th century, as it ramped up its genealogical efforts to do proxy temple rituals for the dead, the church confronted a major roadblock. Many of the historical marriages it was unearthing in its research had been interrupted by early deaths. Suppose a woman had married, lost her husband, and then remarried, having children with both husbands. How were the descendants to know which husband she wanted to be with in the hereafter? Should modern strangers be authorized to make that kind of decision for her or on her behalf? Probably not."
So again, they're creating more problems with this false doctrine. More problems certainly are coming up. Now, one thing that we can be sure of in studying Mormonism, sooner or later, something will cause its practices and its doctrines to change, as though God is in a constant state of change. They complain because they don't think they can trust the Bible, that too many changes or deletions have been made through the years, but they need to look at their own religion's history and note the changes that have been made in their own history and what they originally said God said, and then they find out that he changed his mind about that, who, according to the Book of Mormon, never changes his mind. So we do get confusion all through studying Mormonism.
Yeah, because the Mormon God's always changing.
Yeah, something's always changing. So,
It's
so the church changed the Mormon temple sealing policy for deceased women. And it was in 1969 that David O. McKay extended the rule. He said that women being sealed to only one man was unworkable because of the proxy work that their genealogy efforts were digging up as they were marrying and baptizing people for dead people. Now, this caused even more confusion. And so they decided that deceased women were to be sealed by proxy to all the men that she had been sealed to while living.
Oh.
So now some women could allegedly wake up on the other side with a whole harem of husbands. What in the world would she do?
Wow.
So President McKay merely created a two-level system for marriage, one for the living and one for the dead. All this work and effort and policy change and angst to accomplish something with the dead that means nothing anyway, and is totally in rebellion of God's prohibition of necromancy. We quote from Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy 18:9 through 12. "When you come into the land that the Lord your God has given you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you any who burns his son or his daughter as an offering. Anyone who practices deviation or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord."
So notice that necromancy, which doing all this dead work for the dead that Mormons do, necromancy is called an abomination. God calls it an abomination. He hasn't changed. He didn't change it for the Mormon people. And now, this is a passage that we've quoted quite often in past shows and discussed quite a bit. But it's interesting, we find at least 3 error-filled doctrines in Mormonism's topic of marriage and sealing for the dead. The first one is the Bible denies that there's marriage after this life. So with their sealing practices of temple marriages and so on, they're denying the truth of the Bible. The second one is that the Bible forbids the living to be involved with rituals for the dead, necromancy. So they're doing that as well, something else God prohibits. And 3, the New Testament forbids genealogy. Okay, so they're doing all of these things in their doctrine of temple sealings. We quote from 1 Timothy and then Titus in the New Testament.
Timothy 1, 3, and 4. Charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrines, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies, which promote speculations rather than stewardship from God that is by faith. Titus 3, 9. But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless.
So genealogies are worthless. They're unprofitable and worthless.
That made me so happy, though, because it was such a big burden.
Yeah.
I mean, I had spent hours and hours and gathered so much genealogy. And
that's true so much in others.
And everyone does it. And if you're not doing it, you're looked down upon. And when I found out that I didn't need to do that, I got rid of most of my stuff. I did keep one history binder that I'd compiled, but I let go of so much, and
it's so freeing,
like
isn't it?
bins
This is
of
freedom.
history. I just dumped it in my garbage, and
well, Jesus says, "Come to me, and you can be unburdened."
it was
and, boy, I'll tell you, so true.
That was so true.
So these 3 doctrines are forbidden in the Bible. These 3 doctrines that the Mormon Church is embracing and causing their people to do. Notice that in Timothy it said, "Don't teach any other doctrine," and yet they are. The command to avoid endless genealogies is there not just once, but twice. But Mormonism does not heed what God has forbidden. Of course, if they suddenly started to obey God, they would be seen to have been a false religion from its beginning, and they couldn't risk that either. Now, this entire practice of sealing several spouses to each other for eternity is also a waste of time, because Jesus said there are no marriages after this life. And that those in heaven are like the angels who do not marry. So where are the LDS today with their temple sealing ceremony? We quote.
Living women who'd been divorced can only be sealed to one man. So if they wish to remarry, they have to undergo an often protracted effort to petition the First Presidency to cancel their sealing. Men get to marry again without obtaining any such cancellation. In 2019, the church slightly softened the gender chasm by requiring divorced men to at least ask the First Presidency for a clearance to be sealed a second time. And in 2022, new language appeared in the handbook stating that members of either gender may seek a sealing cancellation even if they are not prepared to be sealed to another spouse. This seems to ease the path of both men and women to cancel earlier temple sealings if they can't stomach the thought of being with their ex for eternity.
Oh boy, problems that they perform and cause through their belief. But true to its historical nature, the inequality with men and women still exists. Living men can be sealed to all of their wives forever if they want, but living women can only be sealed to one man, even if he's not her choice. So what happens in the past for all these women that were sealed to all these men? Has that been changed in eternity too? I mean, what's
confusing.
Going on?
I don't know what's going on.
And then they smooth it all over for the members by telling them God will work it out when you get there. It's confusing now, but God's got it all straightened out. Somehow it'll end up being good for everyone. That is wrong. God has already worked it all out. And all Mormonism has accomplished is to stir up the pot and muddy the waters, bring in false doctrine, complicate the simple, and create a disappointment, misery, and pain in Mormon women who so dislike the idea of sharing her husband either in this life or the next. In the verse that we read earlier in 1 Timothy, it said not to teach any different doctrine, nor devote themselves to myths. And all this eternal marriage, temple sealing rituals, and so on are different doctrine. And they are actually myth. You'll find no teaching of it anywhere in the Bible. And Joseph Smith allegedly restored something that was allegedly lost, yet we don't find that these doctrines of marriage ever existed in any historical biblical practice. We finish with this quote from the article.
Meanwhile, dead women can be sealed to multiple men, just as dead and living men can be sealed to multiple women. See, sisters, equality is coming. You just need to be 6 feet under first. After reading the fascinating history, I still hold the same view I did before. Our sealing practices are inequitable, thank you, and damaging to the women.
Well,
and isn't that true? I actually read the book.
Yeah.
I read that book, The Ghost of
Eternal Polygamy, yeah.
Yeah. What's it called?
The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy.
Yeah. A Mormon gave it to me, and they interviewed over 3,000 women, and I was just heartbroken with all their stories, and I thought, well, if you only knew what it was like to actually live it.
And then they want the leaders of the church to change their mind when it's supposedly God who gave the commandment. How can they? I mean, I don't get that thinking. I get what they're doing, but their thinking is so off.
Yes, and with all the sealings and the necromancing that goes on, that's why there's so much demonic activity in the families. And
there's a lot of it.
I had it until I became a Christian, tormented by evil spirits.
Yeah.
And
Well, they are tormentors, that is for sure. So is their doctrine, their bad doctrine. The writer of this article, of course, and others who voiced their complaint on the LDS and Mormonism's gender equality issues need to know that Mormonism has always been patriarchal from its very beginning. Women are required to be subservient. They're often seen as property and are necessary only because a man needs a woman to get to become a god. Now, in polygamous behavior, women are merely baby factory, and many babies. They have to have many babies to have a great kingdom
for eternity.
For the sexualized God. The female, and to expect them to change doctrine is just ridiculous, because even the Book of Mormon says God does not change his mind. You know, so how would it work if a human changed God's mind for him? That doesn't work either. They're just petitioning for their God to change his mind, which the only true God would not do. He got everything right from the beginning, and the beginning, none of it is found in Mormonism.
Yeah, Malachi 3:6. God is an unchangeable God.
He's unchangeable.
He never changes.
Right. Okay, thank you, Karen. Appreciate
My pleasure.
Your input there. You know, in Psalms, chapter 73, verses 25 and 26, David asks the question, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Now, the psalmist is declaring biblical truth that God is our focus for eternity, not a spouse. He said God is his portion forever, not multiple spouses, not billions of spirit babies, not being God of one or more planets. God alone is our eternal focus. There would be so much pain avoided if Mormonism would just give up their unbiblical doctrine and cling to the biblical teaching alone. Jesus died for our sins. He was buried, and he came out of the grave to prove his power over sin and death. He is Lord. We don't need marriage or polygamy or Mormonism. All we need is Jesus. Thank you for watching.